May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our salvation. Amen. Please be seated. Before I begin, I'll just invite you to take a moment to turn around and look at our beautiful Tiffany window at the rear of the church. I get to look at it a lot more than you do. The hymn that we sang as our sequence hymn, Most Highly, it's not called this, but I always call it Most Highly Favored Lady, is about this. This is the Annunciation, and this is our window. This is the Annunciation window. So in case you'd never identified what that is depicting, that is the moment where Gabriel comes and tells Mary of this most important thing that is happening. So we are lucky to have that window, and I am lucky to look at it a lot. Sometimes, in order to really understand the wider import of a scriptural text, we need to explore all the texts that surround it. And I think this is the case today with the text from the prophet Isaiah that was our first lesson. This text comes from chapter 7 of Isaiah, just after Isaiah has received his formal prophetic commissioning from God in chapter 6. Chapter 7 then begins in this way. When Ahaz was king of Judah, other nations marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it. And the Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out to meet King Ahaz, so that you may speak with him." So God and Isaiah go out to meet Ahaz, and they take turns speaking with him, trying to reassure him that the other nations would not defeat Judah, over which Ahaz was king. God speaks to Ahaz in the words we heard in our first reading. God told Ahaz, "Ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or in the highest heights." But Ahaz said, "I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test." Then Isaiah spoke with exasperation. "Hear now, you house of David, is it not enough to try the patience of humans? Will you try the patience of my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid to waste." What should we make of this text? At first, we might fixate on the apparent foreshadowing of the eventual birth of Jesus. Indeed, Isaiah is used so frequently in Christian worship because of his seemingly preternatural awareness of the course that salvation history would take. But I think that fixating on Isaiah's seeming ability to foretell God's future activity is to miss some of the vital import of this text for our lives of faith. Indeed, if we continue reading into the next chapter of Isaiah, we move beyond Isaiah's interaction with King Ahaz, but similar themes remain, even as the audience changes. Here, it's not entirely clear to whom Isaiah is speaking, but to me, his message feels entirely relevant to the world in which you and I are living. Isaiah says, "When someone tells you to consult mediums and spiritualists who whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? Consult God's instruction and the testimony of warning. If anyone does not speak according to this word, they have no light of dawn. Distressed and hungry, they will roam through the land. When they are famished, they will become enraged, and looking upward will curse their king and their God. Then they will look toward the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness." In both of these passages, the message I hear is this: ask God for signs. Ask God for instruction and guidance. Ask, and you shall indeed receive. Don't be shy about asking, for the Lord your God is awaiting your requests. Or as Paul's letter to the Philippians puts it, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." And yet, by and large, we do not do this. I can't tell you the number of times people have told me some version of this statement. "It feels selfish to ask God for what I want. I feel like my prayers should focus on the needs of others rather than my own needs." And what I always want to say, but I'm usually too polite to say this baldly, is, "And how is that going for you?" Indeed, it's quite natural for us as humans to become preoccupied with cares and concerns. And indeed, when we try to put those concerns out of our minds before giving them adequate space and attention, they don't simply go away. Rather, they often grow larger and larger, taking up more and more mental space with the anxiety they induce in us, which paradoxically makes it even harder to focus any of our attention on the concerns and needs of others. So we need to give our own cares and concerns an adequate hearing if we ever hope to become more available to respond to the needs of our neighbors. One way of giving them a hearing is by bringing them to God in prayer and by asking God for signs and instruction about all that afflicts our hearts and minds. Of course, God may not communicate as directly or clearly as we might want, but all the great teachers of our faith seem to agree that this does not mean that God is not communicating. One of the greatest teachers of our faith, the theologian Thomas Aquinas, has much to say about prayer. And one of my wonderful divinity school professors, Dennis Turner, summarizes Aquinas' thinking in the following way, which I'll quote at some length. He says, Thomas takes for granted that asking God for things is and should be our principal practice of conversation with God. It is not, as Thomas reminds us, that God doesn't know our needs anyway, so that we have to inform God of them. For our Father in heaven knows all our needs well ahead of us. It is rather we who need, in prayer, to set our wants and desires before God honestly and truthfully, just as we experience them, no matter what they are, so that by means of that prayer, our God in heaven can read our needs back to us and interpret them for us. Though God does not need our prayers, we certainly need to pray, for we do not always know what we want. Our desires are complicated, crumpled up, and folded over onto one another, so that we do not recognize what they truly are, and for that reason cannot own them. Therefore, we have to unfold them, explicate them, in the only way possible to us, which is just as we are. That is, confused and befuddled, even as to what desire we are expressing. Thus, in prayer, our desires are at once honestly expressed, just as they are and without pious pretense, and at the same time, those desires are interpreted as to what they really mean. Turner then concludes by saying, in this way, Thomas shares none of that squeamishness about petitionary prayer that one hears sometimes indulged by very high-minded people, as if there were something spiritually immature, small-minded, and excessively needy about asking God to meet our petty desires and wants, and as if spiritually grown-up people will pray only that God's will be done, come what may. Strange it is how such mature Christians neglect the rather grubbier practice, also recommended by Jesus, of asking our God in heaven for daily supplies of bread. Aquinas' teaching about prayer was core to what Dennis Turner tried to teach us as seminary students. Before arriving at Yale, he had had a long career at Cambridge, and he was about as sophisticated as most humans get. And yet he was relentlessly committed to the grubbier kind of prayer that can actually reveal our true desires and thereby teach us who we really are as creatures made in the image of God. I would venture to suggest then that Isaiah is trying to teach us something very similar, albeit in a different and perhaps even simpler and more naked way, which is perhaps why it is so hard for us to hear it. It seems too simple. It seems too basic. It must be far more complicated to commune with the living God than by simply asking for what we want and then attending to whatever ways God answers our requests. And yet, as we hear one chapter yet further into Isaiah, God promises to answer our prayers. We will hear this promise once again when we worship together on Christmas Eve, when Isaiah reminds us that the people walking in darkness will see a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light will dawn. For God has enlarged the nation and increased their joy, and they rejoice before God as people rejoice at the harvest. As we ready our hearts and minds for Christmas then, may we also find our joy increased. And may we find ourselves rejoicing before God as those who rejoice upon an abundant harvest, the harvest even of our very selves. May it be so.